He tripped me during communion. Right there, in front of everyone, just as I was trying to steady myself, the world tipped sideways, and my knees hit the cold stone floor with a sharp crack that echoed louder in my heart than in the sanctuary. The sudden gasp, the uncomfortable shifting of the congregation, the muffled chuckles that bubbled up like a secret they were trying to hide, all of it felt like a betrayal. Not just by the boy who tripped me, but by everyone around me who chose to look away or laugh quietly instead of helping. Even the priest, standing solemnly at the altar, barely looked at me, as if my fall was some inconvenient interruption rather than a moment deserving of kindness or concern. That moment was not simply about a stumble. It was the loudest, most humiliating reminder that, to them, I was an invisible fixture in the pews, a relic they tolerated only because blood bound me to the family, not because they cared to see me. I am 82 years old now, and I sit in the third pew from the front every Sunday, alone, except for a battered hymnal that I clutch as if it were a lifeline, and the ache in my knees that no prayer can soothe. The church, once a place of solace and warmth, became the stage for this small, cruel performance. And ever since, my visits have been marked by that fall and the cold silence that followed it. My name is Evelyn, and I live in a small, aging apartment above a bakery in town. I moved here after I stopped being welcome in my daughter's house. The house where I raised her, watched her grow, and quietly offered the backbone of love and sacrifice that she never truly saw. I have outlived my husband, the man who once promised me the world and left behind memories heavy with both love and regret. My children grew up, scattered like autumn leaves, and none of them made much room for the grandmother I became. My grandson, the same boy who tripped me, is a bright boy, full of mischief and growing pains. But he has learned early on that the world he moves in does not need the presence of an old woman who smells of lavender and stale prayers. I think sometimes that I became less human to him the moment I stopped being useful. I know I was a bother when I asked to be included, when I tried to join in family dinners or asked questions about their lives that they didn't want to answer. I was there, but I wasn't seen. That fall in church was not just about a physical stumble. It was the moment I finally felt how completely I had slipped out of the picture, how easy it was for them to turn away, how deeply the wound of invisibility can cut when it comes from your own blood. I have carried the pain of that day in silence for months now, revisiting it like a bruise I can't stop touching. Every Sunday, as I approach that same spot in the church, I feel the weight of their eyes, the suppressed giggles that hang just under the breath, and the cold absence of a hand to help me up. The way my daughter looked away, her lips pressed tight as if trying not to say the things I longed to hear. I'm sorry, or I love you, or even just, are you all right? Left a scar as real as any physical wound. I am no stranger to disappointment, but this was different. It was a betrayal laid bare in a place of worship, a space meant for grace and forgiveness. Instead, I was made the joke, the punchline, the grandmother who fell and was mocked, the invisible woman in the stained glass light. In the weeks before that Sunday, I had tried so hard to keep my place, to be part of their lives, even if it meant shrinking myself to fit their version of who I should be, quiet, compliant, thankful for scraps of attention. I wore the knitted sweater my granddaughter made me, the one with the bright pink flowers she insisted would make me look younger. I smiled at family dinners, even when I was served last, and heard the subtle sighs of relief when I left early. I watched my grandson play with his phone, ignoring me with a casual cruelty that I told myself was just childish ignorance, but which stung sharply every time. I remembered when my own daughter was a girl, how we'd come to church together, hand in hand, her little voice humming hymns, her eyes full of wonder. Now, those memories felt like a lifetime away, a place I could only visit in my mind. The church itself has changed too. The pews are polished, the stained glass windows glow with softer light, but the faces are colder, the smiles thinner. The women who used to greet me with warmth now glance past me as if I am a ghost they don't want to acknowledge. The parishioners who once asked about my health now whisper behind their hands or avoid my gaze altogether. It is a small, quiet exclusion, but one that has worn me down over time. The tripping incident, cruel as it was, only made visible what had already been happening. A slow erasure of my presence, a silencing of my story. I am not a bitter woman. I do not seek vengeance, only recognition. I want to be seen, not as a burden, not as a joke, but as the woman who has loved fiercely, suffered quietly, and still holds the fragile thread of dignity in her hands. There was a time when I thought family was forever, that blood would always bind us together stronger than any pain or disagreement. But I have learned that family can be fragile, like glass, easily shattered and often replaced with polished facades and polite distances. I still attend church because it is where my heart is, even if my place there has become uncertain. The hymns remind me of who I was before I was invisible, before I was laughed at on the floor, before the grandson tripped me in front of them all. This story is not just about a fall in church. It is about the quiet violence of being unseen, the betrayal that comes not from strangers, but from the people you trusted most. It is about the resilience it takes to stand again, to reclaim your dignity when the world tries to make you small. It is about the moments when the only option left is to pull your own strength up from the depths of shame and hurt and walk on with your head held high, even if your knees still tremble. I don't know how many Sundays I will have left, but I know that from now on, when I rise for communion, I will not let the past fall define me. I will walk with my own steps, and if I must face the boy who tripped me, I will do so not with shame, but with the fierce light of a woman who knows her worth. This is my story. Not the one they whispered about in the pews, but the one I carry in my heart, the one that no laugh can undo. The day it happened, I had woken up early. The kind of morning when the light slips softly through the lace curtains and the house smells of damp earth and old wood, carrying the promise of something ordinary, yet heavy, with the weight of the unspoken. I had dressed carefully, choosing the blue wool coat I bought last winter, the one that still fits just right despite my stooped shoulders and the slow creak of my joints. I wanted to look presentable for church, not because I expected compliments, but because I wanted to remind myself that I was still worthy of being seen, that I still mattered in some way beyond the shadows of their indifference. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth in my hands, and looked out the window at the quiet street where the neighbors were beginning their Sunday routines, mowing lawns, walking dogs, greeting each other with easy smiles. I no longer felt part of. I arrived at the church just before the service began, the familiar scent of polished wood and old hymnals greeting me like an old friend. The pews were already filling with the usual crowd, families with children, elderly couples, and the few stray visitors who came seeking solace or routine. I found my place in the third pew, where I always sat, and pulled out my worn hymnal, the edges softened from years of use. I could hear the choir warming up, their voices threading together in a gentle, hopeful melody that made my throat tighten. As I waited for the service to begin, I noticed my daughter, Claire, and her family sitting a few rows behind me. She was busy corralling her children, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for approval or surveillance, a habit I had grown to recognize as part of her constant need to control every detail, including how I was perceived. My grandson, Jacob, was there too, a boy on the cusp of adolescence with a crooked grin and restless energy that I remembered from when he was small, long before his smiles became edged with something sharp and unkind. The service moved forward with the usual prayers and hymns, the priest's voice steady and soothing as he spoke of forgiveness, compassion, and the grace we are all meant to extend to one another. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words wash over me like a balm, hoping that somehow, in this sacred space, the weight of loneliness and rejection might lift just a little. When the time came for communion, I rose slowly, steadying myself with the pew in front of me, the cold stone floor grounding me as I moved forward with the rest of the congregation. That's when it happened. Without warning, I felt a sudden shove at my ankle, a quick, deliberate trip that sent me stumbling forward, my knees hitting the floor hard enough to sting sharply. The taste of dust and embarrassment filled my mouth before I even realized what had happened. I looked up, expecting to see concern, to feel a hand steady me, but instead, I caught the faintest smirk on Jacob's face, the way his eyes darted away as if daring me to make a fuss. The congregation's reaction was a quiet but unmistakable ripple of suppressed laughter and awkward shifting. My daughter's voice, low but sharp, cut through the murmurs like a warning. "Mom, it was just a joke. Don't make a scene." There was no apology, no offer to help me up, just that clipped sentence, dismissive and final. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from the fall itself, but from the humiliation of being the source of entertainment for those I loved. The priest glanced in my direction briefly, his expression unreadable, before returning to his prayers, as if my stumble were an inconvenient distraction rather than a call for care. I stayed on the floor a moment longer, gathering myself, feeling the sting of skin against the hard floor and the sharper sting of being unseen, unprotected, and disregarded. That moment, the trip, the fall, the laughter, was the catalyst that shattered the fragile veneer of belonging I had clung to for so long. It revealed with brutal clarity that I was no longer a cherished member of the family, no longer someone whose presence was a comfort or a joy. I was a relic, an obstacle, someone to be avoided or mocked in the quiet corners of their lives. The weeks that followed only confirmed this painful truth. At family gatherings, I was met with curt nods and averted eyes. My questions about Jacob's school or Claire's work were met with impatience or silence. Invitations to dinners became less frequent until they stopped altogether. I was reduced to an afterthought, a name mentioned only when necessary, never a presence actively sought or welcomed. The fall in church was more than an accident or a childish prank. It was a symbol of the emotional distance that had grown between us, the growing divide that neither time nor love had managed to bridge. I realized that the boy who tripped me was acting out a learned behavior, reflecting the unspoken attitudes of the adults around him, attitudes that saw me as an inconvenience, a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. I remember one afternoon sitting alone in the park, watching families pass by, their laughter ringing out in the golden afternoon light, and feeling a profound loneliness settle over me like a shadow. It was not just the absence of company, but the absence of respect, of recognition that cut deepest. I was a grandmother who had given everything, only to be pushed aside when the giving was no longer convenient. That Sunday became a turning point in my life. I began to see with new eyes the subtle ways I had been edged out, conversations I was excluded from, plans made without me, the quiet assumption that I would always be there, waiting silently and obediently. I realized that to continue like this was to accept a slow erasure of my identity, a fading into nothingness. And so, quietly and with growing resolve, I began to reclaim myself in small ways. I started attending weekday services alone, where no one knew my name or my story. I took walks in the early morning, breathing in the crisp air and reminding myself that I still had a right to be here, to live, to be seen. The fall was a wound, yes, but also a wake-up call, a cruel, necessary catalyst for change. In the sacred silence after that Sunday service, as the congregation filed out and the church emptied of voices and footsteps, I stayed behind a moment longer. I knelt at the altar, not in prayer, but in quiet promise, to myself, that I would no longer allow myself to be tripped, silenced, or dismissed. The world might see me as old and invisible, but I was still here, still standing, still worthy. The boy who tripped me might not understand the weight of what he did, but I understood perfectly. That fall was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would walk forward with my own strength, unafraid and unbowed, even if my knees still ached. After that day in church, when my knees still throbbed with the dull ache of bruises both seen and unseen, I began to notice the subtle shifts that turned the fall from an isolated incident into a slow, unrelenting tide that threatened to pull me under. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible, like the gentle erosion of a riverbank until the earth beneath your feet crumbles away without warning. My daughter, Claire, who had always been the one I leaned on, the daughter I believed would be my refuge in old age, started treating me with an increasing coldness that no longer even disguised itself as patience or concern. She spoke to me in clipped tones, her words weighed down with impatience, and her eyes often flicked away before I could find the comfort I sought in them. At family gatherings, I became a shadow on the edge of conversations, a presence more tolerated than welcomed, as though my stories and questions were interruptions to a narrative I no longer belonged to. Jacob, my grandson, who had tripped me that day and laughed while doing it, seemed to grow bolder in his disregard. It was not just the incident in church anymore. It became a pattern. I found my reading glasses hidden in the freezer one afternoon, my favorite shawl tossed unceremoniously on a chair instead of folded neatly as I had always taught him. When I asked him why he did these things, he shrugged with a careless smirk, saying, "It's funny, Grandma." The laughter that followed was never mine, though. At birthday parties, he would ignore me entirely, focusing on his phone or his friends, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he would make faces behind my back, exaggerating my slow movements or the way my hands trembled slightly when I tried to hold a cup of tea. Each small act was a silent message. You don't belong here. Not really. The sting of invisibility deepened into a quiet ache that settled in my bones. The house, once a place I called home, became a landscape of exclusion. Claire rearranged my room without asking, removing photographs that held memories of a lifetime and packing them away for safekeeping. My belongings, once treated with care, were now brushed aside like clutter. Family dinners, which used to be a time of laughter and shared stories, turned into hurried affairs where I was served last and encouraged to eat quietly before retreating to a corner where I wouldn't be in the way. Invitations to outings and holidays became fewer and more fleeting, often canceled last minute, with excuses that sounded rehearsed and insincere. When I voiced my feelings, I was met with gentle admonishments to not make a fuss, or that everyone was busy, as if my presence was a disruption rather than a desire. The warmth I had once known in the embrace of family faded into a polite, distant coolness that I could neither thaw nor escape. Social media and family group chats, those modern webs of connection, only served to highlight my isolation. I was removed from the family WhatsApp group without explanation, my messages ignored or answered tersely, if at all. Photographs of celebrations, birthdays, and vacations were posted online. Smiling faces of children and grandchildren framed with captions that never mentioned me. When I called to ask about plans or to share a memory, the phone would ring unanswered, or conversations would end abruptly with promises to talk later that never came. I was no longer part of the story they told themselves and the world. I was a forgotten character, slowly erased from the pages by silence and neglect. The small kindnesses I once held on to as proof of belonging became increasingly rare. The neighbor who used to stop by for a cup of tea no longer came, citing her own busy schedule. The church friends who once saved me a seat or asked after my health moved away or drifted into other circles. The loneliness was a weight that settled over me, pressing down on my chest and whispering lies about my worth and my place in the world. I learned to hide my tears, to mask my hurt behind polite smiles and practiced calm, because showing weakness only seemed to invite further exclusion. I became an expert at fading into the background, at making myself as small and unobtrusive as possible, hoping to be seen but never heard. One afternoon, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn carpet, I found a message waiting on my phone. It was a video sent anonymously to the family group chat, showing clips from church, Jacob tripping me the moment I fell, and the suppressed laughter that followed. The caption read, "Old lady can't keep up." I stared at the screen in disbelief, the sting of humiliation sharper than ever. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the shock of being made a public spectacle by my own family. When I called Claire, my voice barely above a whisper, she said only, "Stop making trouble. You're embarrassing us." And with that, she hung up. The slow escalation of cruelty was no accident. It was a deliberate, unspoken decision by those closest to me to push me out, to rewrite the narrative of our family without me in it. The pain was not just from the acts themselves, but from the acceptance, the complicity, and the silence that surrounded them. It was the absence of apology, the refusal to acknowledge my hurt, and the quiet consensus that my feelings did not matter. I began to question everything I had known about love and loyalty, about family and belonging. How could those who once held my heart so tenderly now turn away with such coldness? The weight of rejection pressed down, threatening to crush the fragile spirit I had tried to preserve. Yet amid the quiet erosion, a small flame of defiance flickered within me. I refused to be erased completely, to become a ghost in my own life. I began to keep a journal, writing down the moments of kindness that still found me. A smile from a stranger, a bird's song at dawn, the warmth of sunlight on my face. I found solace in small acts of care, brewing a perfect cup of tea just for myself, knitting a scarf in deep, comforting colors, walking slowly through the neighborhood park and feeling the earth beneath my feet. These acts were tiny rebellions, small affirmations of my right to exist, to be seen, and to be valued on my own terms. In church, I started arriving earlier, sitting alone in the back pews away from the family, where no one could see me or judge me. I whispered prayers not for forgiveness or acceptance, but for strength and clarity. I listened to the hymns with a new understanding. They were songs of resilience and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, light can return. The fall had been a painful awakening, but it also marked the beginning of a journey toward reclaiming my dignity and my voice. The first escalation was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, grinding unraveling of my place in the family and in the world I once knew. It was a lesson in the quiet cruelty of neglect and the resilience required to survive it. Each small betrayal, each act of dismissal, chipped away at the walls I had built around my heart, forcing me to confront the truth that love, when conditional and withdrawn, can be more devastating than any open wound. But it was also the moment I began to find my way back, to the woman I had been before the fall, and to the woman I still could be, standing tall despite the fractures. The weeks following the slow unraveling of my place within the family marked a profound shift in how I saw myself and the life I was living. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing not just the painful truths I had long suspected, but also the fragile threads of strength and dignity I still possessed, waiting to be woven into a new tapestry of belonging. One I would create for myself, rather than wait to be offered. I began to see the fall in church not as a defeat, but as a turning point, a moment that signaled the end of silent acceptance and the start of quiet reclamation. It was not an easy transformation, nor was it sudden. At first, I found myself withdrawing from the few family gatherings that remained, choosing instead to attend weekday Mass alone, where the pews were emptier and the air was thick with a different kind of solemnity, one that felt less performative and more genuine. In those quiet mornings, surrounded by stained glass and the soft murmur of prayer, I found a sanctuary that was truly mine. No one whispered, no one judged, and I was free to breathe without the weight of expectation. The priest, though familiar, no longer felt like a distant authority figure. His sermons began to resonate as messages of hope and endurance that spoke directly to the cracks in my heart. In this solitude, I found small acts of resistance that slowly built a new sense of self. One afternoon, as I sat by the window in my small apartment, sunlight streaming across the worn wooden floorboards, I pulled out an old coat that had belonged to my husband. It was heavy, navy blue, with deep pockets and large buttons. The kind of coat that carried both warmth and the quiet dignity of years lived fully. I slipped it on, the fabric rough against my skin, but comforting in its familiarity. That coat was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of the life I once had and the strength I still held. Wearing it, I felt a subtle but powerful reclaiming of identity, a quiet assertion that I was more than the sum of their dismissals and neglect. Alongside these symbolic acts, I began to carve out a daily rhythm that nourished my spirit rather than depleted it. I started volunteering at the church, offering my time to prepare the sanctuary for services or to help with the weekly food drives. These tasks, humble as they were, gave me a renewed sense of purpose and connection. It was not about being seen by my family, but about being useful in a way that felt authentic and self-chosen. The people I met there, other volunteers, parishioners who welcomed me without judgment, became a small but vital community, a patchwork of compassion and shared experience that contrasted sharply with the coldness I had known at home. One of the most significant moments of this shift came on a day when the church hosted a gathering for seniors. I arrived early, wearing my husband's coat, the deep green of the fabric catching the light as I walked through the doors. The room was filled with familiar faces, some kind, some indifferent, but I found a place at a table near the window and quietly observed. As the event unfolded, I felt a strange mixture of longing and peace, a recognition that this was a new chapter, not a continuation of the old story. I spoke with a few women who shared their own stories of loss and resilience, and in their words, I found echoes of my own journey. We laughed softly over tea and cookies, our conversations weaving a fragile web of connection that lifted the weight of isolation just enough to make the day feel less heavy. This time of reflection and quiet rebuilding also led me to establish boundaries I had never dared to set before. I stopped answering calls and messages that drained me, ceased attending events that left me feeling small and unseen. I began to say no without guilt, to prioritize my own needs and well-being over the expectations of others. This was not a rejection of family, but a reclaiming of self, an acknowledgement that my life, my happiness, and my dignity mattered in their own right. The world I had known, defined by sacrifice and accommodation, was giving way to a world where I could finally breathe freely and stand firmly in my own truth. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the fading light turn the sky soft shades of pink and gold, I wrote a letter. Not to my daughter, not to my grandson, but to myself. I wrote of pain and hope, of endings and beginnings, of the courage it took to step away from old roles and expectations. The letter was not a plea for forgiveness or reconciliation. It was a declaration of self-respect and resolve. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer, a quiet testament to the woman I was becoming. A woman who would no longer be tripped or silenced, who would walk forward with dignity, no matter how uneven the path. This midpoint in my story was a subtle but profound turning point, a shift from passivity to agency, from silence to quiet strength. It was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by the small, steady acts of self-care and self-assertion that build the foundation for true resilience. In choosing to honor my own worth, to seek out spaces of peace and belonging beyond the confines of family pain, I began to heal the fractures in my heart. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the shadows of the past lingered, but I was no longer defined by them. Instead, I was becoming the author of my own life, writing new chapters with each breath, each step, each moment of grace. As I settled into the fragile new rhythm I had begun to create for myself, the past came rushing back in ways I had hoped to avoid but had to face with steady eyes and an unflinching heart. The second escalation was not a sudden storm, but a slow and insistent pressure that crept into the edges of my life, testing the boundaries I had set and challenging the strength I thought I had gained. It began with a letter, slipped beneath my door one chilly morning, its edges worn and creased, the handwriting unmistakably my daughter Claire's. I held it in my hands longer than I dared, the weight of old wounds pressing down like a stone on my chest. The letter was full of pleas and excuses, an attempt to bridge a gap that had grown wider than words could easily mend. She wrote of misunderstandings, of stress, of how much Jacob missed me, and how much she wanted our family to be whole again. But beneath the words, I could feel the unspoken demands, the expectation that I would fall back into my old role, quietly accepting the pain and pretending it never happened. Not long after, a phone call came that I did not answer, but the message was clear enough. Claire's voice was measured, carefully controlled, but beneath it lay a current of frustration and disappointment. "Mom, we're planning the Easter procession. It's important for the children. We want you to be part of it. Please don't cause trouble." The words, "don't cause trouble," echoed in my mind long after the call ended, a reminder that my place was still conditional, still precarious. I debated whether to respond, whether to engage or withdraw, but the knot in my stomach told me this was not a simple invitation, but a test, a way to see if I could be controlled, if I could be made to fit back into the family mold they preferred. As Easter approached, the church filled with the usual hustle and bustle, families preparing for the procession, children rehearsing their roles, the scent of lilies and incense heavy in the air. I arrived early, wearing the coat I had come to cherish, the one that felt like armor against the cold glances and whispered comments. I took my seat quietly, away from the family, in a pew near the back, where I could watch without being watched too closely. But as the procession began, Claire's eyes found mine, sharp and expectant, as if daring me to refuse or falter. Jacob stood beside her, smirking in a way that chilled me, the same cruel spark in his eyes that had tripped me months before. When the moment came for me to join the procession, I rose with steady resolve, moving toward the altar with the grace I could summon, despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. Jacob's whispered words reached my ears as I passed him. "Don't trip this time, Grandma." There was no warmth, no hint of remorse, only the cold taunt of a boy who had learned that cruelty was his weapon and laughter his shield. I met his gaze for a fraction of a second, holding my head high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shaken. The congregation's eyes flicked between us, the tension palpable in the air. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent debate about whether this was a family drama best ignored or a scandal waiting to unfold. The priest led the procession with calm authority, but I sensed his unease, the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes darted toward the family with concern and frustration. That day, the church was not a sanctuary, but a battleground, a place where old wounds were reopened and new ones inflicted. After the service, Claire approached me with a forced smile, her words clipped and rehearsed. "Thank you for coming, Mom. We want this to be a fresh start." But her eyes betrayed a calculation, a hope that I would bend, that I would apologize for the fall, for the hurt, for my refusal to remain silent. I simply nodded, my voice steady but firm as I said, "I am here, Claire, but I am no longer silent." The conversation ended there, unresolved but charged with the unspoken understanding that this was far from over. The days that followed brought a series of subtle but unmistakable pressures. Claire began to involve other family members, sending texts and messages that painted me as difficult, stubborn, and unwilling to forgive. There were invitations to dinners I knew would be tense, to gatherings where I was expected to play the part of the compliant grandmother, to smile and nod and never speak of the fall or the months of coldness that had followed. I declined politely, choosing instead to focus on the small community I had found in the church and among the few friends who had stood by me. But the isolation I had fought so hard to escape seemed to creep back, wrapped in the guise of concern and family duty. One afternoon, a social worker from the local community center appeared at my door, introduced herself with a warm smile but a professional distance. She said she had been contacted by Claire, who was worried about my well-being and wanted to ensure I was safe. The visit, though kindly meant, felt like an intrusion, a reminder that my family's concern came with strings attached and conditions I was not willing to meet. I assured the social worker that I was well, cared for, and surrounded by friends who supported me. But I could see in her eyes the unspoken question. Why was a woman of my age living alone and resisting the family's attempts to help? Meanwhile, the church community, once a refuge, began to feel the ripple effects of the family's influence. Subtle conversations and cautious glances reminded me that the story of my fall and the tensions within my family were not secrets anymore. The Sunday bulletin included a request for prayers for family unity, a gentle but pointed reminder that healing was expected on my terms, not mine. I found myself walking more often, avoiding the familiar pews and the whispered judgments, seeking solace in the quiet corners of the park, where the rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds offered a kinder company. As Easter turned into spring, the pressure mounted. Claire sent a lawyer's letter, formal and cold, outlining concerns about my capacity to manage alone, suggesting family meetings and professional assessments. The tone was clinical, devoid of warmth, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The letter arrived on a day when I was already exhausted by the weight of loneliness and the constant struggle to assert my independence. I read it slowly, the words blurring through tears that I refused to let fall openly. The letter was not just an attempt to control, but a declaration of their intent to reclaim what they believed they owned: my time, my space, my dignity. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat quietly in my living room, the letter folded on the table beside my cup of tea, thinking about what it meant to fight for oneself when those closest to you wield power like a weapon. I thought about the boy who tripped me, about my daughter's clipped apologies and thin smiles, about the priest's uncomfortable glances and the congregation's whispered gossip. And I realized that this second escalation was not just about family or church. It was about the larger battle every woman of my age fights to be seen and respected in a world that too often dismisses us as invisible or burdensome. The tension reached its peak one chilly afternoon when Claire and Jacob came to visit unannounced. They arrived with forced cheer, the kind that feels rehearsed and fragile, like a glass about to shatter. Jacob's eyes held the same sharp edge, and Claire's voice was carefully controlled. They spoke of reconciliation and the importance of family, but beneath the surface lay the old patterns of control and expectation. When Jacob passed by me, his smirk returned, a silent challenge that ignited a fire I thought had long been extinguished. Without thinking, I reached out and, with the swift clarity of a woman reclaiming her dignity, I pulled down his trousers, exposing him to the stunned silence of the room. The shock on his face was immediate and raw. The laughter that had once been mine now turned back upon him in a quiet, powerful justice. Claire gasped, her composure breaking for the first time, and I stood tall, unashamed, knowing that in that moment I had taken back the power that had been stolen from me. The visit ended abruptly, with Claire's angry words hanging in the air and Jacob retreating into stunned silence. But in the days that followed, I felt a shift, a subtle but profound change in the dynamic that had held me captive for so long. The second escalation, painful and tumultuous as it was, became the crucible in which my resilience was forged. I was no longer the woman who could be tripped and laughed at. I was a force to be reckoned with, a grandmother who refused to be invisible or silent. This chapter of my life was not defined by the cruelty of family or the echoes of past pain, but by the fierce determination to reclaim my dignity and my voice. The road ahead remained uncertain, but I knew now that I would walk it on my own terms, with strength born of hardship and the quiet certainty that I was still here, still standing, still worthy, and still unbreakable. The moment I had longed for and dreaded arrived with a quiet inevitability, unfolding one Sunday morning in the church that had witnessed both my fall and my rise, my silence and my defiance. Easter was approaching, the most sacred time of the year, when families gathered to celebrate renewal and forgiveness, and the air was thick with anticipation and whispered hopes. I arrived early as usual, the familiar weight of my navy coat settling over my shoulders like a shield, and took my place in the pew, a little apart from the others, observing but no longer invisible. The congregation was a sea of familiar faces, some welcoming, others distant, many caught between pity and judgment. But my gaze was fixed on the family, especially on Jacob, my grandson, who sat with that same mischievous spark, unaware that the story was about to shift. The procession to communion began as it always did, the soft hum of hymns filling the sacred space, the priest moving with reverence and grace. As the line formed, I felt a calm settle over me, the kind that comes not from ease but from a quiet determination forged in the fire of long endurance. When I reached the spot beside Jacob, I hesitated for a fraction of a second, a brief moment where the past and future collided. But then I acted, with the precision of a woman who had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times. I reached out and pulled down his trousers. The fabric slipped down swiftly, revealing his boxers to the entire congregation, the room falling into stunned silence. The shock on his face was immediate and raw, a flush of embarrassment flooding his cheeks as he stumbled backward, his dignity stripped away in the most public and undeniable way. The gasp that followed was not laughter, but a breath held in collective disbelief. The congregation's eyes widened, the usual murmurs stilled by the sheer unexpectedness of the act. The priest paused, his expression unreadable, caught between protocol and the undeniable truth unfolding before him. I stepped past Jacob with my head held high, each footfall steady and sure, walking to the altar with a grace that spoke louder than any apology could. In that moment, I was not just a grandmother reclaiming respect. I was a woman breaking free from years of invisibility, a person asserting her worth in the only language that could no longer be ignored. Jacob sat down, his face burning with a shame that was not just personal, but public, the sharp lesson sinking in deeper than any scolding could have taught. I sensed the shift in the room, the subtle realignment of power and presence, and though the echoes of the moment would linger for days, weeks, I felt a profound peace settle within me. This was my stand, my declaration that the cruelty and disregard would no longer define my story. The quiet dignity I had cultivated through months of pain and reflection had found its voice, and it was loud enough to be heard. After the service, the tension was palpable. Claire approached me, her face a mask of anger and disbelief, her voice low but sharp. "What you did was humiliating," she said, her words laced with the frustration of losing control. I met her gaze steadily, feeling no shame, only the strength of a woman who had finally broken free from the chains of silent suffering. "It was necessary," I replied calmly. "It was time you and Jacob learned what it means to respect me." The confrontation ended there, unresolved, but charged with the unspoken truth that everything had changed. In the days that followed, the fallout was as expected. There were whispered conversations, cold shoulders, and awkward silences at family gatherings I was no longer invited to. But there were also moments of unexpected support. An older parishioner who told me quietly that she admired my courage, a friend who called just to say she was proud, a stranger who smiled with recognition when I entered the church. The act that had seemed so radical, so risky, became a symbol of my reclaiming, a turning point that others saw as the moment I stopped being invisible and started being seen. The boy who had once tripped me now understood the weight of his actions in a way that no words could have conveyed. He avoided my gaze for weeks, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary that had been drawn. And though the family tried to sweep the incident under the rug to restore the old order, I knew that the narrative had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the silent grandmother, the forgotten presence. I was a woman who had stood her ground, who had pulled back the curtain on the pain and refused to be made small. That Easter marked not just a day in the church calendar, but a milestone in my life's journey, a moment of profound transformation that echoed far beyond the stained glass windows and polished pews. It was the climax of years of struggle, a crescendo of resilience and courage that affirmed my right to dignity and respect. And as I sat quietly in my apartment that evening, the soft light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. The battle was not over, but I had won something far more precious: the right to stand tall, to be heard, and to be seen. In the quiet of that night, I wrote a letter, not to my family, but to myself. I wrote of strength found in moments of pain, of courage born from humiliation, and of the unyielding spirit that refuses to be broken. I tucked the letter away in a drawer, a testament to the woman I had become, a woman who no longer allowed herself to be tripped, silenced, or forgotten. This was my story, not a victimhood, but a victory, a story I hoped would someday inspire another woman to find her own voice and stand tall in the face of adversity. After the tumult of Easter and the quiet upheaval that followed, a calm settled over my life, like the gentle hush that comes after a storm. The tension in my family remained, a fragile silence that spoke volumes in its absence of warmth or reconciliation. But I had crossed a threshold that no words or cold shoulders could erase. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself returning more often to the small sanctuary of my apartment, a space I had come to cherish, not just for its walls, but for the peace it represented. Here, free from the demands and dismissals of others, I began to rebuild a life on my own terms, grounded in the quiet dignity that I had fought so hard to reclaim. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn wooden floor, I sat by my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a small plate of lemon tart, a recipe I had perfected long ago, but rarely made for myself. The tart sweetness lingered on my tongue, a simple pleasure that felt like a small celebration of the woman I had become. The house was still, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of life outside my window. It was in these moments of solitude that I felt the full weight and the gentle lightness of freedom. I was no longer tethered to the past by silence or shame. I had stepped out of the shadows into a quiet, steady light. The family did not come to see me. Invitations ceased entirely, and the phone remained silent except for calls from a few distant friends who had stood by me through the years. I no longer waited for apologies or explanations, understanding that some bridges, once burned, could not easily be rebuilt. Instead, I chose to nurture the relationships that nourished my soul. The kind words of neighbors, the smiles of familiar faces at church, the unexpected comfort of a letter from an old friend. These connections, though modest, reminded me that belonging could be found in many places beyond the narrow confines of family. One afternoon, I received a small, unexpected gift, a drawing from a young girl in the congregation. It was a simple picture of a grandmother and a child, hand in hand, beneath a bright sun, with the words, "Grandma, you are strong," scrawled in uneven letters at the bottom. I held the drawing close to my heart, tears blurring my vision not from sadness, but from a deep, quiet gratitude. It was more than an apology or a sign of forgiveness. It was a reminder that my courage and dignity had not gone unnoticed, that I mattered to someone beyond the walls of my own home. In the evenings, I began to write letters, not to the family that had distanced itself, but to other women like me, women who had been silenced, dismissed, or made invisible. I wrote of resilience and hope, of the strength found in standing up for oneself even when the world insists you stay small. These letters were my way of reaching out, of weaving a tapestry of shared experience and quiet empowerment. They were not always sent. Some I kept tucked away in a drawer, a private testament to the journey I had traveled and the woman I had become. The church remained a part of my life, not as a place of judgment, but as a refuge where I could find moments of peace and community. I no longer sat in the same pew as the family, but found my own space among those who saw me without pity or disdain. The priest, once distant, now greeted me with a nod of respect, and the parishioners who had whispered behind their hands offered smiles that felt genuine. In this small community, I discovered a new kind of family, one built on acceptance and kindness rather than obligation or control. Reflecting on the journey, I understood that the fall in church, the laughter, the tripping, and the subsequent trials were not the end of my story, but the catalyst for a transformation that had been long in coming. I had moved from invisibility to presence, from silence to voice, from pain to quiet strength. The act of pulling down Jacob's trousers was not one of cruelty, but of reclaiming power and demanding respect in a world that had too often denied me both. As the seasons changed, I continued to live with intention and grace, embracing the freedom that came from choosing myself when others would not. I learned to love the woman I saw in the mirror, the woman who had weathered storms and stood tall despite them. The scars remained, yes, but they were part of the tapestry of resilience, proof that I had survived and thrived. On quiet nights, I would sit by the window with my journal and a pen, writing letters to the younger versions of myself and to the women yet to come. I would remind them that dignity is not given, but taken, that strength is found not in perfection, but in persistence, and that the courage to stand alone can lead to the most profound belonging. These words, written in the soft glow of lamplight, were a gift I gave to myself and to anyone who might one day need them. This is not just my story, but a shared story, one of countless women who have been tripped, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. To them I say, do not wait for permission to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. Take your place with quiet courage and fierce love. Your story is not over. It is just beginning. And when you find your voice, use it to build a life of your own, one that honors your worth and celebrates your strength. In this final chapter, I am no longer the woman who stumbled in the church, nor the one who was laughed at or ignored. I am Evelyn, standing tall, speaking clearly, and living fully. And if this story finds you in a moment of doubt or despair, know that you are not alone. There is strength in your steps, dignity in your silence, and power in your voice. Walk forward with your head held high, for you are seen, you are worthy, and you are enough.